Hi, welcome to the Church Split. My name is Will, and today we have another special guest with us. Many of you guys might know him from before, but we have Bradley Vazquez, or however you want to pronounce it. I've heard many times people say your last name differently, so I'm just going to roll with this. So we have Brad Vazquez with the Altarnate Media. He has been on our channel before. He was on our very first debate when we had audio issues for the first half of it, but Brad's a good sport, and he's able to just kind of roll with it. So Brad, thank you for being on. How you doing?
I'm doing great, man. It's great to be here. I've been looking forward to this actually a lot.
Yeah, you mean like when we talked about it like 8 months ago and then it fell through? And
I know, right?
So for the viewers who don't know,
we're finally getting around to it.
Yeah, exactly. I literally texted him and Seamus at the same time. I was like, hey, I think we got our software up. Who's up for an interview? And Seamus responded instantly. It was like, dibs. And I was like, okay, Seamus it is. And I was like, Brad, we're going to get you like next week. And I meant almost next year. So, but life is crazy. So thank you, Brad, for being on. So I guess we'll go ahead and just jump into it. This is, so you are, well, I'll let you actually just go ahead. What is your religious background?
So that's an interesting question. I grew up for half of my life as an independent fundamental Baptist.
Amen.
In a local Free Will Baptist church. My dad was, one of the more well-respected Sunday school teachers and on the church board and whatnot. And that's how I grew up. I grew up steeped in Baptist doctrine. But then towards my teenage years, kind of from 12 years old on, my family kind of started to go down the Torah observant path, or at least the Torah practicing path. And so that's kind of it's been a long journey. It's been a fun journey. I don't necessarily like to call myself Messianic Jewish, because if you Google that, you're going to find a whole lot of stuff that's not me. I really don't align with the Hebrew roots movement, actually, because there are a whole lot of stuff that's definitely not me. So I kind of just narrow it down to I'm a disciple of the Master, Yeshua.
That's fair enough. So yeah, that's what's funny. Every time I've tried to explain who you guys are, I'm like, no, they're not Messianic Jews. They are Jewish in their faith, and they do recognize Jesus as Messiah, but that they wouldn't identify that they're not really Jewish Christians or Christian Jews. Because it's just there's so much baggage with words, and so I totally understand. And the Hebrew roots movement, I joined a few of the groups thanks to yourself, and there's definitely things in there I'm like, oh yeah, that's weird, definitely weird. So very I don't know, abstract and ambiguous with some of their beliefs, I guess. So yeah, anyway, so that's probably a whole other video topic for yourself. So anyway, so you grew up steeped in the IFB. You said you're a Free Will Baptist, so that means you were independent fundamental Baptist, but that meant you guys probably more practice like the doctrines of Arminianism, essentially, like free will would be the central, would you say?
Yeah, the understanding that, it's an acknowledgement, absolutely, that nothing can remove you from God's hand, but you have the free will to walk away from the faith should you choose, or what they call backsliding.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Exactly. So, all right, that's interesting, because the Independent Fundamental Baptist it's such a small group, but it's also very broad in its beliefs. Sometimes you find very much more Calvinistic leanings, where like my church growing up wasn't really Arminian or Calvinist, but some would say that our pastor leaned one way or the other, and then you have the Free Will Baptists in that. So, and that's probably what makes it interesting for me when I discuss with you, is you totally understand my background as well, because as you know, I was raised as an Independent Fundamental Baptist. Now, were you guys also? This is for my own curiosity, not even in here, but is this? Were you also like a King James onlyist type, or what? Like how?
Oh yes.
Oh, really?
So well. On a personal level, because I was a kid. This is the church that I grew up in, and so all of the Sunday school teachers, your children's church teachers and everything, that's what you had to read out of, because that's what they had, and so that's pretty much all I had. And I grew up learning all of the jargon about the King James being the most accurate and the only inspired version and whatnot. My dad, however, always kind of reinforced that you probably need to have more than one version on your bookshelf. My dad had a bookshelf that probably the first two shelves of it were all just different versions of the Bible. And he did always kind of try and steer me in the direction of, look, if you want to study a topic, open several all over a table and see what they all have to say.
That makes sense. I just recently was reading through. Oh yeah, when I did my divorce video, there was that whole verse in Malachi that talks about like God hates divorce, and it's funny because in the King James and all these others it says God hates divorce, and in the other versions it renders that verse entirely differently. So yeah, there's definitely value there. So thank you for indulging my curiosity there. So you guys, you switched essentially to more, would you say, Torah observant in your faith? Is that the way you would word that?
Yeah, well, I would say practicing Torah. To be truly Torah observant means that you're, doing it perfectly, contextually speaking. Nobody's actually observing Torah. Everybody is practicing Torah.
Okay, everyone's right. Okay, I got you. All right. So good to be precise with your words. I appreciate that. So you're more practicing Torah. So the thing is obviously that's a big for, especially most of my audience I know I have some atheists and I know I have a lot of evangelical Christians. So whenever I have you guys on, I think probably people are just going, what? What does that even look like? Why? How? What crazy realm did I just jump into? So would you be able to just kind of talk about what were the biggest things that made you convert? Like what made you make this complete shift? I know your dad had a huge deal with that, so go ahead and jump into that.
Yeah, and I'll tell a little bit of his story, kind of as an introduction to this. He was a Sunday school teacher, like I said, and one of the more well-respected ones. It was a pretty common thing in the youth group. If one of the teenagers had a question about something the Bible said, it was like, oh, let's go see what Mr. Vazquez says about it. And like nobody really cared to hear what the pastor had to say. So that became a problem eventually in the church. But my dad being a Sunday school teacher, you go through the same material almost year in, year out, and it's different, but it's all the same lessons. And he kind of realized that he got to a point where it's like, okay, yeah, I get it. I know this. I know, when you think that you know everything, that's a problem. So he had a humility moment with God there and asked him to show him something new. And so he opened his Bible and there was Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, and so on. And that it hit him in a whole new way where it's like, okay, now hold on. Maybe there's something to this. And that got the whole ball rolling, really. The whole family kind of bucked him on the process most of the way. My mother was supportive in person, but even she herself would tell you that, privately they had disagreements, which naturally is how a family should work. You should disagree privately, not in front of the kids.
Agreed.
Me and my dad actually struggled the most about it because he and I are cut from the same cloth. Yes, I joked with you the other day talking about it. I was like, if you've seen me, you've seen my father, right? So we not only look just alike, but we're very similar in personality. And so I can't tell you how many nights we stayed up till 4:30 in the morning yelling at each other scripture back and forth. And it's kind of one of those things where, when people say that I approach them in a way like I already know that I'm right and that I can't accept that I'm wrong, it's like, well, no, the problem is I've already been wrong about this issue, like several times. So that I think the main issue, though, that I would say really kind of pulled me in would be the Sabbath and kosher law, church holiday history and biblical holiday history. Those four things are kind of, when you take them all together, they kind of build a pretty heavy case for why God laid these things out the way that he did.
Okay, so we're going to definitely jump into that with the holidays and the history there. We definitely we'll talk about that. So what do you believe is the strongest argument in favor of being Torah practicing?
So I actually have. Anytime that I get into a discussion, I've debated this topic enough online at this point to where you can almost predict what's coming next in the discussion. And so actually I've come to a point where I can almost guide the discussion based on what I decide to say, so I can instigate them to respond a certain way, because, especially with Baptists, because I understand Baptists, so it's like, okay, I know how to like hold your hand through this argument. But really, I've kind of just come up with a short list of verses to where it's come to the point where when it gets challenged, I'm just like, okay, look up these, come back to me after you're finished. And I guess really, I'll go ahead and tell you what they are. Jeremiah 31 through 34, Matthew 5:17 through 19, Matthew 7:21 through 23, 1 John 2:4, 1 John 3:4, and 1 John 5:3. Make it through all of those. Come back and tell me what you think.
Fair enough. I know one of them is definitely, when Jesus says that no dot or tittle shall be removed from the law, right? And I came to fulfill the law, but the Greek word that's there is meaning to establish. And when people think fulfill, they mean to completely like rip out entirely and toss it into the dumpster fire. So I think so just for context sake, for people who are wondering, like these are some of the things that are brought up in these conversations. So, Brad actually, he sent me a book series and it was, oh my! It's often said. Yeah, wow, that was Jinx. You owe me a Coke. It is often said, but so that series actually really helped me go. Oh, I see. Like I get it. I understand where this is going. Okay, so I find that to be really interesting, and I find if we're going to jump into how Christians have sometimes responded, but first off, what was the hardest thing for you to relearn? Because my favorite part about this with you is the fact that apparently you did not go silently into that good night. You were not like, okay, Dad, you win. I'll never eat bacon again. You fought him tooth and nail, which is only what I'd expect from you, by the way, from what I've known about you. Yeah. So what was the hardest thing for you to relearn, to adopt this new way of life?
So for me, it actually wasn't the dietary issue. That was a hard one. We spent many nights arguing about that one, because I'm already a carnivore by nature. Full on Ron Swanson. Don't feed me the food that my food eats.
Gold.
But no, I think really the hardest thing, and in my experience with new people that. I've been in this long enough now to see the movement not only grow nationally, globally, but even locally, and kind of seeing other people walk through it. It's a familiar thing to see people struggle with now, because it's something that I struggled with, and that would be the idea of Gentile inclusion into Israel. Kind of realizing the church's place in Israel and the role of Messiah as it pertains to and relates to the Jews. The idea that there is no spiritual Israel that has replaced the Israel that was. Like, the Jews are God's people, and that's going to be a thing forever. So kind of this idea that, well, no, we're the real deal now, and our job is to go and convert them into what we're doing. And it's like, well, that's not really the case.
Yeah, that's actually something that stuck out. Now, are you familiar with the new perspective on Paul or the writings of N.T. Wright? People like
it's not something I've done a ton of research on. Actually, I spoke to my dad about it the other night. He has done a ton of research on it.
Shocker.
Yeah, right. And so he actually did tell me it's they call it the new perspective on Paul, but it's not actually like extremely new. This is kind of something that's been around and being discussed for a long time, but I think it's gaining more mainstream popularity in the recent days.
Yeah, no, it came out, like the very first paper was like in '67. That got great acclaim and it really took off in the '80s apparently, but now recently it's having a resurgence. The reason why I'm asking is I just did my research paper on it, and when you're talking about the Gentile inclusion to Israel, one of the things that stuck out to me, which is what stuck out with our conversations, was that the different views of Israel and the church. It's like the thing that everyone's wrestling with. The Reformed view is obviously the fact that the church replaced Israel, right? So the church inherits everything. Of course, I have a lot of issues with that because God made promises to Israel, and God doesn't break promises, and he doesn't replace promises. So that, for me, brings into question God's promises. Like, okay, well, how good is it until he gets tired of me and frustrated enough with me that he replaces me? So that Reformed doctrine on that I have a real issue with. And I don't think also the Bible brings, I think you have to really twist scripture to make that happen. Then, of course,
Yeah.
so, Then there's the dispensational view, of course, which is that Israel and the church are just two separate entities, but that God loves them equally. They would say like Israel is, Israel is, wow, his like beloved, and then like the church is the bride of Christ, which you might be playing with some semantics there.
The apple of his eye versus being the bride of Messiah.
Right.
And yeah.
So, and then your guys' view, which is what it talks about directly in Romans, which is essentially that no, Gentiles are just included now, right?
It's what Paul says. It's like, no, you were once far away from the covenants of promise, cut off from the promises of God, but because of the blood of Yeshua HaMashiach, like you've now been brought in and included, like you get to be part of it.
And especially if his covenant first began with Israel, it would make sense that his covenant was expanded to other people as opposed to like throwing the Reformed view, which is throwing Israel out entirely. It's crazy to me.
It's funny actually. I had a discussion with a pastor that I was, I don't want to say interning under the youth pastor at, but we actually discussed that and Jeremiah 31, and kind of the way that he weaved that into Jeremiah 31 is because, God mentions first the divided kingdom. He says, this is the covenant I'll make with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. So that's talking about like Israel proper. But then later it's just, this is the covenant I'll make with the house of Israel, no Judah, right? And so that's he sewed into that's where the separation between old Israel and spiritual Israel occurred. And kind of one of the problems there is you've actually depleted one of the primary messianic prophecies, is that the whole idea in Judaism of the person of Messiah, and part of the reason Jews do not accept Jesus as the Messiah today, Orthodox Jews, that would be, is because, so he came and the 10 tribes, the 10 lost tribes were not returned to the fold. He did not unify Israel. And that's why what they derive from that is, so God says, this is the covenant I'll make with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, divided kingdom. Okay. By the end of this covenant, it will no longer be a divided kingdom. It will just be Israel once again. And that's something that the Messiah was supposed to accomplish. So when you like take that out of the whole context, it's like, well, what does he do now? What's his job?
I get that. No, definitely. So that's what I find to be like, that's definitely an interesting part of the conversation for me is, how does the Gentiles fit into the, everything. So I find that this conversation, that this is one of those things that's like, you guys do a lot of work on your channel and are going to be putting out some more things soon. Some people don't know that if they have subscribed that they probably just don't realize the fact that you guys were working through technical things, but it's going to be balling now. So,
yeah.
But what blows me away is the fact that, you guys once mentioned the fact that there is this weird anti-Semitism sometimes attached to some church doctrine, maybe even unintentionally. And it's funny because I was like, what? That's crazy. But then it's funny, as I've looked at it, I'm like, oh, well, yeah, when you're throwing out Israel, when you're doing these things, I see where that comes from. See, I was always raised basically that Israel is the treasured possession of God, that they are the special people, and you're lucky you're part of it. That was my teaching. So for me, it was so foreign to me when you explained that to me. I was like, wow, people actually have those views of Israel? That's insane. But anyway, so here's my next question, I guess. So what exactly obviously we could talk on, by the way, obviously more and more about these fun doctrinal things where I love that. I will sit there and talk about that all night, but I do think it'd be fun to dive into some other things, just tease some people there on what they might be able to see with through your guys' teachings on your channel, and maybe we can have some of that here a little bit. It'll be a good time. But bottom line is, you cannot separate Israel from your Christianity in any way, shape, or form. Like if you separate that, you're detaching a giant chunk of your Bible. One would say 95% or more, and also all the authors of the Bible happen to be outside of Luke. Like all.
Yeah. Well. He was a Jewish convert.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. So, all right, let's go ahead and jump into this. So what sort of treatments have you received from other Christians regarding your beliefs? Because you, I bet, have ruffled some feathers a few times.
Oh, yes. Well, I guess at first, initially, when my family, started going down this path, and it kind of what made it hard for me, being, a young kid, 12 years old, was the being ostracized by the church community, because we kind of tried to just, privately we did our own thing, but we'd still go to church on Sunday and kind of, just be part of the community there. But when I think one of my little brothers happened to let slip when offered a hot dog at like a church function, that they don't eat pork, it's like that immediately circulated around the church via the gossip chain so fast. And so then we started being treated differently. My dad started getting phone calls from the church deacons about, how they believed they could prove their point from the Bible better than him, which is laughable to say the least. But it eventually came to a point where some people ended up having to come to my dad and look him in the eye and say, "Do you still believe that Jesus is the Messiah?" And my dad's like, "Of course. What? Why is that a question?" But apparently that is the rumor that he no longer did was something that started circulating the church, and we're not really sure where from. It doesn't matter at this point. But yeah, my dad still gets ugly looks in town from people from back at that point. So for me, that kind of going from that community, all the friends that I had, to not being allowed to see them anymore because they didn't care, because kids don't care, right? But then also being treated differently by the adults, causing the hostility between me and my parents. And I guess it kind of took the phases of like young atheism. When an atheist first becomes an atheist, they're like super hostile to everybody who's different. And so like that's kind of how I started out, is when I did jump on board, I would just like take what I knew and just slap other people over the face with it anytime that like they approached me with any slight hostility or just questioning. And to my shame, that's been a problem for me, is that like people might be genuinely curious and asking, but because my knee-jerk reaction, having experienced hostility, is to go into defense mode. It's like I'm instantly like dukes up if you ask me a question, and I've had to train myself out of that, and it's been a journey. But yeah, a lot of hostility, because first thing people are going to say is that you're part of a cult. And then you get called a heretic.
Oh, the heretic always has to come up. It's not a good theological debate until you call someone a heretic.
A heretic, and then a Pharisee, which is the best one, I think. But
how dare you be a student of the word like a Pharisee?
Right?
That's actually the irony too, when people use Pharisee as an insult all the time, and I'm like, the Pharisees get a bad rap. I mean, okay, so you had a few people who are confused. There's a lot of cultural elements that rose into those. So I think when you go all Pharisee bad, you're like, okay, you realize that the Pharisees were the ones who were the students of the word for hundreds of years. Okay, some certain traditions of certain people in power shifted some things to the point where yes, Jesus had to correct certain things, but you also notice that not every Pharisee hated him. It just said a group of Pharisees that would ask him questions.
I would actually say that really plays into kind of what I said earlier about the church's inclusion into Israel being the hardest thing to drop. Is part of that is like your immediate hatred of the Pharisees that you grow up having instilled in you your whole life is like, it's like they don't actually teach you to do it, but like, in church, when you hear the word Pharisee, it's like you're encouraged to be like, boo, you know? So like,
So true.
I've come to a point now where what I love about that discussion is when somebody starts, using the word Pharisee in a negative context, I love to throw in there. It's like, well, Jesus probably was a Pharisee, so
sorry. Yeah, or then there's the Sadducees too, right? And that's the thing is like people forget who Paul was as well. Like, and all these people in the New Testament, these amazing major players, it's like, no. They also, there's this misunderstanding of Judaism as well, which is this that I've noticed. People think that because someone disagreed back then, they must have been horrible people, because everyone likes the idea of a universal, hence the Catholic argument, right? A universal church. We all agree in unity. We're of one mind. They take that and they run with it. No one can disagree. And people disagreed all the time throughout the eons in Judaism and even the early church, which I think is funny how Catholicism tries to always claim this, we have this amazing unity. I'm like, are you crazy? Your priests argued all the time on every doctrine.
It's kind of, the emperor forced you all to come to like a, what's the word I'm looking for? A compromise for political reasons. Like,
but we don't talk about history here, Brad. That's history's hateful and racist. You should know this by now. That's a bad Brad. So let me ask, do you actually try? So obviously you've had a lot of persecution, kind of to a degree with your faith. People have mistreated you. I find it so funny. Brian was literally cracking up over here when you mentioned the fact that your dad, like when this whole thing went around about, I don't eat pork. And for me, I just think it's so funny because if somebody came into church and said that they're on the keto diet or the Atkins diet, no one would bat an eye. But someone says, I choose to hold kosher laws, and everyone loses their minds. It's so bizarre to me. Even if you think you can as a Christian and you don't think there's anything wrong with it, that's fine. Okay, then why is it not a liberty issue for you? Who cares what they eat? If you truly think there's nothing wrong with eating those things, then somebody not eating those things would equally be not wrong.
On the hostility note, one of the things on that front that you will experience a lot really is people trying to secretly feed you pork. Oh my gosh, you have to be so careful around people that you already know don't like you because of what you believe, because like they will like good, honest Christians will try and feed you something that they know that your beliefs do not align with.
Oh, that's so disrespectful. That's so like someone's over here like, I believe this is a sin against me and God to do this, and they're like, oh yeah, let's just make him do it. Like,
the funny contrast, actually, one of my older friends, who he grew up in the South, so he grew up somewhat religious, but not like too ingrained in Christianity, but he understood the Christian God, and he had a semblance of faith, but he lived a more secular life as well. He respected it the most, actually, when he invited me over for his little girl's birthday party, and there were going to be a bunch of other people there. Like, he took the initiative to look up like kosher law as far as like cooking meals separately from what's going to be unkosher. And so he made sure to clean his grill, like cook my steak separate from all of the other ones that are going to be wrapped in bacon, and like he took the initiative to respect my religion. And this is somebody who's like, if you're from the IFB, he would have been a bad Christian.
Well, that's the funny irony of it all. In fact, I know that there's people like that. I know someone who I could point out right now that would be that way, that used to go to my church, who had a fit about something like beer, saying that it's offensive for me to even have something like this around. Meanwhile, I know that he says all the time, like, we should find a way to go to the town mosque and put pork everywhere, and let's mail them bacon. And he said jokes like that all the time. And I was like, well, that's still, and I was like, that's still disrespectful. Like, I'm not a Muslim, but that's not the way you combat things. Anyway, it's absurd. So I get that. That's funny that people would try to feed you pork and not just simply respect your decision. That's so strange to me, but okay. So do you strive, let me ask you this, because obviously now people, if they're listening, they're going to be all triggered maybe, or they might actually be respectful. I'm hoping I have a respectful audience. That's what I'm trying to cultivate at the church split.
I feel like you do. I
feel like I do, but we'll try. So, but do you try to or strive to convert others, or do people just attack you for holding your different convictions?
I really don't. I don't actively try and convert anyone. That's. I don't want to say it's not my job because, the whole idea of the Great Commission and whatnot. So if a lost person who doesn't, even have a relationship with God, I'll share with them as much as they're open to. Obviously, you don't want to smother people because that pushes them away. But I don't actively go out and try and convince people of what I believe. If they are curious about why I do something differently, then they'll ask a question, and I will answer the question, and they will respond however they do, usually with hostility, but sometimes not so much.
Yeah, that's good. No, I mean, even you and I have had conversations, right, where it's like it's not hostile. It's always been respectful. And especially dietary laws. I had a conversation with you and Seamus at the same time, and I was like going back and forth, and we were just having a good old time discussing Acts chapter 10. And that was a lot of fun. And I think that's what people forget to have with these things, where it's like, dude, if you disagree, you can have so much fun and learn so much from somebody, and they might change your mind. You just have to be willing to have your mind change. And if what you believe is the truth, you shouldn't be scared, because if what's true, I say this all the time, like, I want to just believe what's true. I don't want to believe what's convenient. That means if someone challenges me, I should not be scared to defend it with the truth. And then if I find that the truth that I thought was the truth is actually a well-disguised lie, then I ought to adhere to this truth the truth that person actually has. So, people are weird about it. It's just that tribalism. We like to have our own minds made up. We like to think we're always right, and that's just the fact is you're just not. And that's why I have this sign up here, cheeky, because there's no way. Like, I know I'm not always right. So, but anyway, so how do you respond to people that say Jewish writing? This is my favorite one, because doctor, no, he's not. He's far away from that.
He's not a doctor.
Steven Anderson put out this whole a documentary where he basically said that all Jewish writings are very anti-Christian, especially in the Talmud. So how would you respond to people that say that Jewish writings are severely anti-Christian?
First of all, it's not that simple. It's the first thing to try and explain to people, is that it's not that cut and dry. You kind of have to understand the complexity of the subject you're talking about. For instance, the Talmud is case law for Jews. Just because you read one verse from a tractate, and people do that all the time, is they'll pull one portion of a tractate and then post it out there like, this is what the Jews believe. And it's like, no, they don't. One rabbi said that, and if you read the rest of the tractate, he was probably responded to by 4 other rabbis who didn't agree with him. So it's like, on some things you'll read it. Basically, it's a discussion, or it's so and so said a long time ago, and so and so a little more recently said in response to that, and that's kind of the in the name of Reb, so and so, and what have you. And sometimes it'll come to a conclusion, and there will be a legitimate ruling on that subject. Sometimes it's left with no conclusion because, nobody's been 100% right yet, and several people made convincing arguments. But as far as also the anti-Christian aspect of it, there are parts of the Talmud that speak very, very negatively of someone they call Yeshu. Now, whether or not that is Yeshua, is still kind of up for debate among historians, because first of all, it was a common name in Judaism, and not all of them historically were good people. Also Talmudically, he would have been called the Nazarene. There are several other titles that he's acknowledged by, and believe it or not, even the brother of Jesus, James, or as he's recognized in Judaism, Yaakov HaTzadik, Jacob the righteous is what that would translate to. Like, he's got his own excerpts in the Jewish Talmud. Like, you can read words from Jesus's brother, and
it's actually kind of dope. I'm not gonna lie, that's kind of cool.
Well, and another thing about that, the fact that he is acknowledged by Jews as a tzaddik, which that's the Hebrew word for righteous, right? Tzaddik.
Yep.
It's derived from the same word that means charity, tzedakah. That title in Judaism means that you are, as far as all physical appearances go, you live the most biblically perfect lifestyle of the whole generation. So the fact that Jews acknowledge the brother of Jesus as being that level of righteous, I mean, that speaks.
Yeah, no, sorry, I wasn't sure if you were done, so I wanted to make sure.
Yeah, no, that was pretty much it. I mean, other than that, I typically like to pull out a couple of examples of stuff that we accept today that are Talmudic, and kind of go under the radar. I typically use, if you can lead a horse to water, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Now, that means something in modern society where, people typically think it means that you can show someone the right path, but you can't make them walk it. It's actually a Talmudic rendering on how to properly observe the Sabbath if you are like a farmer who owns animals and livestock. Because the whole goal of the Sabbath is not to work, but you can't neglect your livestock because that puts their lives in danger. So what do? So you can lead the horse to the water to have a drink, but you cannot lift the bucket so the horse can drink from it. Stuff like that. And even I'll even point out a few times where even Jesus uses Talmudic reasoning and arguments that you will find in the Talmud, where Jesus is blatantly walking in the footsteps of some of the rabbis who came before him.
And that kind of goes into the whole thing. Like, that's when people were using like the Talmud. I've heard people quote the parts of the Talmud to say things about Jesus. And I was like, well, the thing is, you got to understand is the fact that the Talmud is really just like a collection of rabbinical thoughts, all responding and conversing with each other over the eons. And what's funny is that we could equally pull pastors who have written various different things about various different people in the Bible. And just because one evangelical pastor said it doesn't mean you can condemn all evangelical pastors. Likewise, it's the same idea over here. And so that's helped some people. Like I said, I have a better understanding than most Christians, I feel like, as far as Judaic thought. I'm not amazing there, but I'm trying, because I think honestly there's a lot of truth there. And I'm finding the fact that as I studied through different rabbinical thoughts, especially like on topics like divorce and whatnot, I'm like, oh, Christians have gotten this so wrong. Like that's because these were all understood through the eons, and even Christ calls back to some things. So anyway, we're not going to get too much into the weeds on all that good jazz. But so let me ask you. So now you went, we just did a really long conversation about progressive Christianity. So so these people are progressing, and some people might say is regressing, but back down more to the Common Core, right? Like, you're like, no, I'm going back to the root. These people are going, Lord only knows where. So what are your general thoughts toward people who are who are mainstream in their Christianity today, and how do you think that can apply to you and what you guys are doing?
So I guess my general thought towards mainstream Christians is it's a case by case scenario. Every individual is going to be who and what they choose to be, and that for me actually it limits who I even expose my beliefs to, because only some Christians are even curious enough to ask. There are Christians who I call them pew sitters. They go and they just accept what's there, and then that's they did their Christianity for the week.
Have some that go to my church.
But there are some who genuinely, they want to learn, and they want to have a deeper connection with God, and they actually read their Bibles, and that I've noticed is the most important thing is having having camaraderie and communion and discussions with Christians who actually read their Bible is probably the most beneficial thing that can happen. Now, you do get met with hostility more often than not in my case, but I would say one of the benefits of the more progressively minded Christians is that because of their non-judgmental nature, they're actually more open to listening and hearing me out. While
such a double-edged sword, man, that cuts both ways.
It's got the potential to become its own cancer, and it has. I have watched even the Messianic Jewish community and the Hebrew roots community. If you observe them as they are today, that's not what they were 15 years ago. You know, like I have watched these communities like drift from one trend to another because of the influence and the influx of more charismatically minded Christians and whatnot. Because there's appeal there. One thing I at the risk of being a little offensive, I think that I've noticed about the more charismatically minded Christian is that they enjoy having something that you don't have access to. And so the idea of having this special Jewish knowledge that the rest of Christians don't know, like that's really appealing. And so they like dive in completely. But there's always the comfort zone, which typically ends up being the Pharisee, the Jewish literature, like that stuff is kind of, that's the part where it's like, well, no, you're still wrong.
But I'll take all the things I like, but I'll leave the things I don't. But no, actually, that's actually. I have a lot of friends who are charismatic Christians, but there's actually a lot of truth to that. Every, and here's the thing: if you're watching this, guys, every circle has its thing. All right. The IFB people, they like to be right at everything and never question a thing. Okay, so you go there, they're all right. And when you go into the charismatic house, it's having something that no one else has, or it's this idea of look how spiritual I can behave and act with certain, and it's very ambiguous and more abstract, which is why you get the weird speaking in tongues situations and all these things that everyone's like, oh, in order for me to be spiritual, I have to speak in tongues like them, and all these weird other things. So anyway, well, that's good. So essentially, you're not running around kicking down doors. You're not like a Jewish Krampus just running around ruining everyone's holiday. But
not exactly.
Not exactly. Slightly. No. Okay. But as a practicing Jew, this obviously means, since I like that Krampus segue, obviously means you follow a different holiday schedule, though, because you do not follow a lot of the holidays that people follow today. So let me ask you this simple question. Why is that? Why do you follow different holidays?
Well, the short answer is because the Bible says so.
I knew that was coming.
No, well, because the Bible does say so, and even some of them that the Bible may not say so in as many words. So there's always the debate, even in the Messianic Jewish circles, about Hanukkah. Okay, so where does Hanukkah fit into the Bible? It actually does. There's an instance in John where, as John 10:22, if you want the source, Jesus is mentioned as having been at the Feast of Dedications. That's Hanukkah. So it's in the Bible. It's not commanded to observe it, but it is in the Bible, and we know Jesus did it. And if we're supposed to live like Jesus, then therefore Hanukkah. And also, it's just such an awesome holiday. Like if you read like through the book of Maccabees and understand the history behind it, it's like, what a victory story. Like, the 300 Spartans of Thermopylae is awesome, but like the Maccabees were awesome.
The Maccabees, like when the Hebrews went straight beast mode and
right?
Exactly.
Seriously, but it was prior to that there were atrocities happening that the Jews have never actually seen that kind of persecution. Maybe the Holocaust might actually rival it, but it's, put it this way: Antiochus Epiphanes, the reigning emperor at the time, is actually the Jewish role model for the Antichrist. That is when they think of the Antichrist, they think somebody who's going to persecute us as bad as that guy did. So the Bible says so, and there are instances of holidays in the Bible that we can see. Obviously, Passover, Sukkot, the rest of the biblical holidays. But also, when obviously, if I'm looking into the biblical holidays, then my question became, well, where did these Christian holidays come from then? Like, why do we do these things, and what are the origins of these traditions that we have on these days?
And these are like Christmas, Easter, those ones, right?
Yeah, Christmas, Easter, even Halloween, because that started out as a Catholic tradition. Your All Hallows Eve and All Saints Day, and I forget what the day before that is. Halloween is actually a Trinitide, where it's like 3 holidays back to back.
Yeah, I know, like, because it's also got some like. There's Christian root, then there's also like the Celtic thing. There's like there's a lot of weird history that somehow slammed in on like that October 31st. So
yeah, and so when you look into it, and we did a video already, kind of comparing Passover and Easter, because they fall generally in the same area, almost always within a week of one another. You'll have Passover and Easter. And so Seamus and I did a video addressing that. So go look at that. But we go over some of the differences. We go over the traditions of what you would do at a Passover Seder, and then the history of where some of the Easter traditions came from. And we're currently debating over whether or not we're going to do it as a Sukkot special or as a Christmas special, because those two holidays do not fall anywhere near each other, but they do correlate to one another in one aspect, and because of that, we're kind of debating on when we're going to release that episode.
Okay, all right. I'll keep an eye out. I'll have to check out that episode. I don't think I actually saw that on there. I thought I watched all yours. I guess I must have missed one, or maybe I missed more than one. I don't know. I'll go check them out. It'll give me something to do at work tomorrow while I'm doing audits. So, like, you mentioned before to me, and this is, and I had a discussion, I wouldn't call it a debate. It was more of a discussion on how we could do these things. That's actually one of my favorite parts of having conversations with you and Seamus. It never feels like we're fighting. It always just feels like, okay, but what about this? What about that? And we have a good conversation. So, by the way, you people learn how to do that. Anyway, so when it comes to these things, you've mentioned before that occult practices have made their way into the church and various different areas. So would you mind us waxing eloquently on what you mean by that?
So what I go over a little more in detail, I'll make it a little more brief here for Easter. One of the lesser known actually traditions of Easter is to have Easter ham. Wake up Sunday morning, you have the sunrise service. That one also has its own roots. Lent leading up to Easter has its own roots in paganism. So you've got what is, I don't want to misquote it. I don't have the source in front of me. I think it's 40 days of Lent, however many weeks.
I don't practice Lent, so I think it's something like that. But
yeah, so it begins on Ash Wednesday. So Ash Wednesday, first day of Lent, they get the ashes on their forehead, and you have the period of Lent where traditionally, so they fast from something. Some people do smoking, some people do cigarettes. In the ancient days, it would have been meat. I think fish was the exception, but they wouldn't have eaten meat, and then so you rise on Easter Sunday to greet the sun and have an Easter ham. Those all directly correlate to the ancient god Tammuz. All of that. It is said that while on a hunt, because he also, just like his father Nimrod, was a mighty hunter before the Lord, and on a hunt, as the legend goes, he was gored by a boar. The people started weeping, covering themselves in ashes, as we call this weeping for Tammuz. You'll read it in the Bible and some of the prophets. So you've got the element of the ash, and then there was a hunt for this boar that lasted the exact amount of days that Lent happens to be. So obviously on a hunt, you're not eating meat because you're hunting meat. And they kill the boar. They acknowledge Tammuz as having risen as the sun the next day, and they feast on the flesh of this boar that killed their previous king. That would be the official history, and you can. I understand it sounds super crazy. You can fact check
No.
that.
No. I just made the face because it's like, wow, because it eats the flesh of the board and everything. I'm like, okay, are we talking about Catholicism right now, or are we? Yeah, no, I see what you're. I see what you're connecting. I see what you're connecting.
Things like the Christmas tree. That one is such a treasured one in Christianity because it's like, well, but how could that be evil? And we've ascribed so much positive biblical symbolism to all of them, but the idea of the Christmas tree being evergreen, it represents, life in that instance, and it stands erect. And so you take this tree that stands erect and you cover it in balls.
Classy.
If you get what I'm going at there, it is a fertility symbol, which is also why the wreath is also shaped in the form of the female parts, as it were. All ancient pagan occultic symbolism almost always directly correlates to sexual imagery.
That is true. I definitely know that is true.
Yeah. And it used to be when we first started going down this path, and Christmas time would come around, and all my Christian friends, they post on Facebook, what's your favorite Christmas verse? And I'd be like, Jeremiah 10, like the first 5 verses.
Oh my, cheeky.
Because it is like it's describing the fastening of an idol, but like if you read it, it kind of describes a Christmas tree.
I'll have to look at that in that sense now. I'll have to read it and think of rocking around the Christmas tree.
Yeah, well, and also, so December 25th, even the date that was said to be the birth of Mithras, the pagan Roman cult that was kind of competing with Christianity around the same time. That fact is being contested here recently. I won't get into that, but most Christians know Jesus was not born on December 25th.
Right.
So the question of when he was born, and we'll address this in the video, but I can prove using the book of Luke that he was likely born on or around the holiday of Sukkot. And I can prove that using the book of Luke emphatically.
Okay. I'm excited. I like how you keep like you're not spoiling. Like you're like, oh no, you're gonna come back to my channel to hear the rest of that conversation. I enjoy it.
You guys have to subscribe to me.
Links in the description below. This stuff I find this stuff a lot very interesting. Now the ultimate question is that naturally Christians are going to ask, and I have actually asked you and I've had conversations about this. Is do you think you can separate the practicing of say Christmas as a time as a holiday? We decorate a tree innocently. We put all these little presents at the bottom of the tree, and for us it's a holiday about remembering the birth of Christ, even though we know it didn't happen at this point, and a day of family and of giving to one another. Do you believe you can separate that from its pagan roots, or would you say that the ground has been soiled?
I would say, I guess the short answer would be no, but it's a little more complex than that because there are obvious positive elements to the holiday season. It's even statistically recorded that miraculous occurrences are more likely to occur during the holiday season. Coincidentally, also more suicides happen. That's irrelevant, but if you
sorry, that got dark. Continue.
Yeah, no, we went like super high and super low with that one, but no. So miraculous occurrences do actually occur more frequently during the holiday season, and there's no scientific explanation for that. So there's obviously a relevance to the positivity surrounding it, but I do also think that the acts in and of themselves, with knowledge, I don't think anybody's doing anything extremely wrong if they don't know any better. But to him who knows to do good and does it not, it is sin. So if you already know better, it's like, well, God tells us not to worship him the way that the pagans worship their gods. He actually says that a couple of times in the Torah, your first 5 books of the Bible. So I get the whole idea of rebranding all of these traditions and saying that now it's about Jesus, but it's like, well, God already told us not to do that, and if you really think about it, it's almost like taking your significant other to your ex's favorite restaurant for a date.
I've never heard it put so eloquently before. That's actually kind of funny. I grew up at my church. They all celebrated, of course, but there's one. I know there's like 2 families that wouldn't, and for similar reasons. And that's just really funny. I need to message them now and give them a good example. It's like bringing your ex to, it's like bringing your girlfriend to your ex's favorite restaurant.
Yeah. Well, I think in addition to that, there's a certain nature tied to actions, and I think a lot of Christians would even agree with that sentiment if you give them the right example. But there's an inherent nature involved in stuff, and it is very hard to remove that. Even by rebranding it. And the example that I give to people whenever I'm having this debate with people, because believe it or not, this is a big one. The holidays is a big debate.
Well, I can imagine, because that's a big thing that they engage in with their family and stuff. So
Exactly. And believe it or not, that is the number one argument that it boils down to. After you've addressed every other theological point pertaining to the holidays, it all boils down to, well, this is when I get to see my family. And to me, that's sad, because it's like, well, if you don't have a better excuse to see your family than to meet at this specific time of year, that's depressing, really. You should make the effort to see them other times of the year. But no, I forgot where I was even going with that. Continue.
Okay. I think that's fair enough. Now, for people who are wondering, like, Will, where do you? Because I know I'm over here, like, yeah. Where do you? With me? I mean, just so you guys know, I did celebrate Christmas last year, but I've always just wondered if there's a way you would be able to, because I'm like, well, I know there's pagan things or pagan roots attached to it. I know there's that in the history. So my question is always, but has it not evolved, I guess, into something else now? And okay, now you know.
That's where
now you're going. I could got that ball rolling.
That's where I was going. The example that I give to people, right? Because so it seems innocent enough. You set up a tree, that already has its own phallic symbolism, and it's intended to represent a certain pagan god. And you decorate it. You say it means something different, and then you set the gifts under it, which depending on how extremely nitpicky you want to be, you have to bow to it in order to set the gifts underneath it. But be that as it may, you can rebrand it. That's fine, and that seems innocent enough. The example I give to people is like, okay, so what about Halloween then? Because a lot of Christians that's the one. They're like, no, that's the devil's holiday, right? And it's like, okay, but what if we made it about Jesus? What if the orgies that might have taken place on Samhain in the ancient Norse periods, what if we did that and said that we were doing it in Jesus' name to kind of celebrate the winning of new souls to God and whatnot? And it's like, you can rebrand anything you want. There's really no place where you can just draw the line and go, well, no, that's blatantly evil, or that's blatantly, if you can rebrand it, you can rebrand it.
So what you're saying essentially is, so instead of trying to rebrand it, just go back to all the holidays that God already implemented to His house of Israel, and you're good. You still got plenty of holidays, right? That would be your
you actually have.
I was gonna say, because if I know Jews, is they kind of like to party.
Oh yes.
So you're definitely not that's what's funny, because people are like, oh my goodness, what do you do with all your holidays? I'm like, technically you get more. Like, so you get to cash in on more. So just the fact that the rest of society doesn't do it with you. So, and it's more of the rest of society like over in Western world, because in other areas of the world it's whatever. The Chinese has their big New Year, but we don't really care about it over here. But anyway, so that kind of, you mentioned the fact that there's some things are connected to. So this helps us jump into our next topic. And it was funny when you and I were talking about what we should talk about in here, and then you were like, well, people are going to think I'm crazy. I don't even care if they think I'm crazy. Let's just have a good time. And so just so you guys know, I do want to address this because I do want to talk about spirituality and spiritualism a little bit and how it connects to Judaism, because you've mentioned it. And the first thing I want to talk about real fast is the absurdity of belief, which is no matter what, people hear something and they go, that is absurd because it's something that you don't believe. We always think that someone that we disagree with believes something absurd. Pro-choicers believe pro-lifers are absurd. Pro-lifers believe pro-choicers are absurd because they are. But not saying some of the absurdity is wrong. But the point is here, as we talk about some of these things, remain respectful and just think, just because you're hearing this from somebody maybe for the first time, does not mean they're actually crazy. It means they actually may have looked into something that you might not have looked into. Because I know you have this weird, dark kind of obsession that you like to study the occult and whatnot as well, which is a guilty. It's okay. When I was like in 6th grade, I had a fascination with medieval torture. Okay, whatever. Call me insane. Like, I'm not a serial killer. I swear, just don't go digging around in my flower garden, okay? That's all I'm asking. But anyway, so spirituality and spiritualism, what Christians today tend to, and we mentioned this pre-interview, that it's almost like they have this belief of, I call it practical atheism or materialistic Christianity, which is that they deny almost demon activity. Like, they hear something supernatural and they go, oh, there's no way, it's got to be a rational explanation, and they instantly give the atheist response. There's a rational explanation instead of something supernatural. And the Bible makes you cannot possibly be a Christian and deny the fact that there are supernatural elements to the universe. So what is the Jewish view of things like the spiritual realm and mysticism? And go ahead and feel free to take that conversation whichever direction you want.
There's so many ways to go with that one. The spiritual realm, that's actually rather singular in Jewish thought. There are understood to be four what they call olam, or worlds, four realms, in a descending order almost, which we, as physical beings on a physical earth, reside in the lowest, most base, degraded form of. So low, in fact, that we take a physical form. Obviously, if you understand the idea that things have a spiritual nature, and if you're somebody who does believe that there is a spiritual reality or a spiritual world in general, then that you understand that's the next level up. If the idea that the Holy Spirit exists on another plane separate from us, while coexisting in our plane, but in another realm altogether, it's like, okay, well, that's obviously a realm up above ours. And Paul even references this when he references the third heaven. I've heard people try and rationalize the scientifically physical aspects of what he could be talking about, but
like
again,
the stratosphere and whatnot.
I've
I've heard those things as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and for me, it's one of those issues where it's like, okay, now you've taken the verse as you're reading it in the 21st century and divorced it from the fact that Paul was a Pharisee, right? So if Paul is a Pharisee who understands philosophy as Pharisees do, then that word or that phrase "third heaven" means something, and what it means actually is the third heaven would be where the Jews believe that the Garden of Eden is being kept. It's heaven. That is their idea of heaven. Is that's the third realm above ours, and then above that would be the fourth, which is, it's like it exists but it doesn't, because that's like where God in His entirety exists. It's kind of that whole, because Christians understand the concept that no man can stand before God because you would be consumed by Him. And so in order to create a creation that could exist without being consumed by Him, He basically had to create somewhere where He's not. Is kind of the idea.
Okay.
And hence the idea of the Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh, the Shekinah, these other emanations of God that do exist and operate and work within that creation, shielded from basically the part of God that would consume all
without
of creation.
beholding his entire countenance, so to speak.
Exactly. It's the way it's described is actually almost like, he just put a blinder between himself and his creation, like a screen or something to kind of just dim the light, as it were. It's not a great example, but it's the closest thing, I guess. So that's one concept as far as realms are concerned. But in addition to that, they also have the understanding of 10 dimensions, which, as far as I'm aware, science is only just now coming around to that conclusion.
Well, so I mean, Brian and I have referenced plenty of times Jewish writings when it comes to even our understanding of the universe in general, because we're like, well, do you really think that God would allow his people to believe a complete and total blatant lie about the nature of all things in the universe? And, it's like, especially when you have someone like Moses who walked with God, had face-to-face essential conversations with God, so it's like, I think when they have a nudge on something in ancient writings, and the fact that none of it's been able to be proven wrong is a pretty solid example of how things could work. And now, as far as spiritualism, mysticism, and all this stuff, because these things make Christians uncomfortable. As soon as we start talking about some people who just instantly are like, I don't know how I feel about this.
I don't know about that.
So, what are some things that you would? I think it'd be fun if you mentioned your Angel of Death talk, just for kicks and giggles at some point. You got to talk about that. That's fun. But otherwise, what are your other as far as mysticism and spiritual realm? You've mentioned before the neutrality of the spiritual realm. Would you be able to kind of explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so that actually usually gets brought up in the Harry Potter discussion, because obviously the subject of magic is it's a very muddy discussion in Christian circles, because you've got the more progressive Christians who are totally okay with any kind of literature, at all, as long as it's not racist or bigoted.
Where's the lie, though?
Am I wrong? You tell me I'm wrong.
No objections.
No. So, but then you've got the more strict Christian circles where it's like, okay, so they're okay with Lord of the Rings, but not Harry Potter, and then the even more strict Christians where it's like they're okay with Narnia, but not Lord of the Rings, and definitely not Harry Potter.
I was that one. That's where I was raised. Narnia's great. Everything else bad. I'm like, but he used magic in Lord of the Rings. It's different. He didn't have a Jesus lion. Is there a Jesus lion? No, there's not a Jesus lion. All right, then. Don't quote the old magic to me.
Do not cite the deep magic to me, witch. No, but that is a thing. That's actually, it's the same Baptist church that I grew up in. Was they hated Lord of the Rings, and Harry Potter was just out of the discussion entirely. But Narnia was okay, and that's because C.S. Lewis was more blatantly a Christian than Tolkien. Tolkien was still a Christian and even a religious scholar at that, but he disguised it better. So actually Tolkien, the kind of where I go with this is actually based on something Tolkien said, where he said he feared that a day would come, because you got to remember he existed in a time where the scientific advancement was making leaps and jumps, and so this idea of rationalizing everything scientific became so important. And I guess he had the foresight to see this leading people away from the understanding of a God. So he said that he actually feared the day where he would have to convert his grandchildren to be pagans before he could convert them to Christianity, just because you would have to convert them to be pagans to get them to acknowledge spirituality at all.
Wow.
Before you would get them to accept Christianity. And I think that is a result of what we're seeing in what you call materialistic Christianity, or the atheist term. I love that one. I can't remember.
A practical atheist?
Practical atheism.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there's this shy away from anything that uses the term magic. And it's because the Bible does speak very harshly against, sorcerers, necromancy, witchcraft. These are the words that we'll read. And those are all different Hebrew words, and they're all very specific because Hebrew is that way. none of them encompass the idea of the ability to, I guess you could say, harness spiritual energy, or, access the next realm, as it
Shoot
were.
fireballs from your hand.
Yeah, that's probably a little less accurate.
What?
At least I don't know anybody who's achieved it, but
Yeah, bummer. That's actually what I've always said to him. Like, guys, that's what the Bible's referring to there. If I could conjure fireballs and shoot them, you'd see a lot more people being able to do that.
yeah. Well, and part of that is, the example I always use with people is because it is the most cut and dry example that there is. Moses turned his staff into a snake. Pharaoh's priests turned their staffs into snakes. Okay, now we call one of those magic and say that it's evil, and we call the other one a miracle and say that God did it. And it's like, okay, yes, but miracle is just the word that Christians use to disguise the fact that it's magic.
That it's like, yeah, it's a divine intervention, a supernatural activity from God's. So again, so when it comes to the spiritual world or mysticism or magic, however people want to talk about it, or miraculous activity, it is neutral at the fact that it's just like anything, it can be good or bad, right? It's neutral where, I could use this to enjoy, or I could shatter it and stab Brian in the kidney,
Yeah.
There's different realms and how that works. So, I mean, that's kind of also been always my understanding of the fact that, and that explains also why, say, the apostles were able to heal. Obviously through the divine Holy Spirit working, that obviously God was working through that. But again, you can't say that one supernatural activity, if it's in a book, let's say, like Harry Potter or whatever, one supernatural activity in a book is just as evil as that, when it's like, well, no, that's the whole context. That's what makes the Lord of the Rings thing so interesting, is obviously the ring kind of is like sin. It corrupts everything it touches. Then you have someone like Gandalf, who's more of like the Christish kind of figure. He dies, comes back, and he's powerful and all this stuff. It's like, well, that was kind of what Tolkien was kind of getting at. It, if you look at it allegorically, is the idea of that the supernatural realm that exists outside of the Middle Earth is impacting, but it's neutral as how these things are used. And which is funny that I'm using Tolkien now to explain this, but he does a really good job actually at that. And also, if you get into like the lore of it, it's funny because it makes you wonder how much of I'm not going to lie, it makes me wonder how much of the Judaic stuff he actually understood, because when you get into the further lore, it's like,
yes. Honestly, both C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, the worlds that they created and the lore around them, actually, like, even me, with the understanding of Jewish literature that I have, I've been like, wow, that's actually really, how did he know that? Like, like, I know that because I've looked, but how did he know that? Because he was a Catholic, right? And so, yeah, it's kind of one of those, the idea of a physical action affecting a spiritual change is really, that is magic summed up. I tell people it's the applied force of will, the ability to will something into happening via whatever conduits you decide to use physically, if that's the case. And so the example of the beer sitting next to you, you can imbibe that, and for some people it makes them violent, and for some people it makes them affectionate. Now, can you genuinely tell me that the beverage next to you is inherently evil because of one of the reactions it yields in people? Another way I try and explain it to people is to say that something like magic, to first of all to acknowledge that it exists, which you kind of have to if you believe that anything in the Bible is true. Then you acknowledge that there is a spiritual realm, and there is a mystic force of sorts that either you believe that people simply use it for evil, or you believe also that the apostles and prophets and whatnot have used something similar as far as their privileges that God has allowed for them to be used through them. But to take that and say that something like magic is just inherently evil is to grant Satan the power of creation ex nihilo.
Well put at the end.
to acknowledge that anything is inherently evil at its core, beyond any shadow of a doubt is to say that it came directly from Satan. Therefore, Satan created it and God did not. So you have just given Satan the power to create the same way God does.
Oh, that's
You've made him equal with God.
I get, okay. I'm picking up what you're throwing down there. That's an interesting way to put it.
If something exists, then God created it. Satan can twist it and use it to his purposes, but it exists to be used for good. That's why God created it.
Well, yeah, well, that makes sense. And that's actually funny because, like, as I studied too, when I was looking at scripture, because, you know, the reason why I talk about materialistic Christianity is because that's kind of where I fell for a little bit, where I'm like, okay, some of the stuff's just kind of, you know, a lot of religious jargon is simply. And then I realized, like, okay, once I have this idea, then none of the Bible starts making sense. And then I realized, like, okay, no, I just got to start accepting it as it is what it is. And then as I've also studied more into occult practices and whatnot, you can actually see that these things are actually pretty much a reality. So what would you say is a big proof of, to those who would doubt, what would you say is a proof of the reality of it?
For Christians especially, the inherent knowledge of sin and its effect on humanity. The fact that physical actions that you can do will inherently separate you from God. That is an open acknowledgement that magic is a real thing. Your internal will to physically do something to rebel against God has now separated you from him. And another example I like to use with people, kind of that segues into this, is drugs, especially hallucinogenic drugs.
I was just about to go there.
Yeah, that is why are those a sin? Christians acknowledge that they're a sin, but why? If it's just a physical action, if there is nothing spiritual inherently tied to this physical action, and it's simply a scientific process of the chemicals and enzymes mixing in your DNA and affecting your brain and your cognitive ability, as scientific as that can be, why is that inherently bad? Why does that separate you from God? Because if you acknowledge that hallucinogenic drugs are a sin, then what you're acknowledging is the inherent spiritual nature involved in these drugs, and that kind of circles back to the whole dimensional idea of realms with hallucinogenic drugs, because I guess maybe some people do just see stuff, but I think maybe some people see a lot more that's real than is not.
It's funny you say that, because Brian and I have a good friend of ours who got into like DMT and whatnot, and it was one of those things where this person kind of messed up their faith and stuff quite a bit, but at the same time, he knew when he did it with his buddy, he knew parts about his buddy's past his buddy had never told him, and vice versa afterwards. Like, they just, like, it transcended something. And there's a lot of these stories. Like, I'm not making this stuff up. Like, you look it up, you hear this all the time, where people start figuring things out. They saw things that they did, and all this. So it makes you wonder, okay, so when you do that, what are you tapping into? And it's probably something that you don't belong tapping into. And I've noticed some people who get involved in that sort of thing, that's when you know that some of these people who get involved in it, it messes them up bad for their life. And it's not just because they're just over the shooting heroin every weekend. It's like they even once or twice that they've done it has messed them up. And it's because it's like, I think you have, and I think there's some truth to this, where I think you've entered into something you were not intended in your physical form to enter, if that makes sense.
Yes. That is kind of more so my beliefs on that. And that kind of also segues into certain examples of psychosis. If you think about it, the idea of a human being that's not in control of their own mind, that goes against all nature, really. My personal belief is actually that there are far more patients being treated for a scientific what's perceived as a scientific problem, and it's actually a spiritual problem.
Absolutely, I agree.
I think a lot of psychosis can be attributed to a spiritual deficiency or a spiritual problem of sorts. But going back to the idea of drugs and the idea of being open to something that you're not intended to be, this kind of brings us around to the angel of death idea and whatnot is that so the idea of the 10 dimensions as they exist in Judaism, also in a descending order, as it were, and again, we reside on the lowest version of that, which is why we take a physical form, because everything corporal, everything physical is that's the most base, which is again why physical actions are the ones that are like the most sinful, as it were, because it's something that you're doing physically rather than for a higher purpose. So their idea of the angel of death, first of all, well, back to the whole dimensional idea is obviously we exist on a spiritual plane for this life because this is where we're supposed to be. We're not supposed to access those dimensions, as it were. The idea of the angel of death is not that he's the evil figure that comes for your soul at the end of your life.
He's not the Grim Reaper.
No, yeah, he's not the Grim Reaper. He's actually your escort. He is what transports you through these dimensions, as it were, to protect you from other worldly influences that exist in each of these levels, as it were. And any of your followers who have read through the Book of Enoch actually may have been exposed to this idea because. Enoch, we understand he was taken by God, but so the whole apocryphal book of Enoch, being that he is being escorted by an angel through. When I first started reading it, like I'm starting to read all of the levels of heaven that he's going through. I'm like, man, I wonder if this ends at 10. It does.
It does.
It does. It ends at exactly 10. But some of what he describes seeing is absolutely horrifying, and. So the idea being that if hallucinogenic drugs, very particularized, by that I mean certain drugs access a certain dimension, kind of thing. If you get that literal with it, then what you're doing when if you believe that these hallucinogenic drugs are not just causing you to have hallucinations scientifically, but rather they are opening your physical eyes to a spiritual realm that you're not intended to see, then you don't have that angel to protect you. You are alone in that, and I think that's where a lot of the negative experiences that people have come from. I've had a few friends who have dropped acid, and almost all of them have experienced some form of seeing what they would call hell open wide. You see the ground open up, and what they would describe as hell. Like that's what they explain having seen. And also, don't go into bathrooms. This is the big thing. If you're going to do acid, don't go into bathrooms. You'll get lost forever, and especially don't look in the mirror. And I'm like, well, that's kind of telling too, because what are you afraid that you'll see in yourself? Like, why? What's there that's bothering you? So yeah.
Oh, interesting. That's I feel like there's just like a wealth of things we could just go down in that topic, because there's so many theoretical things where you're like, oh, because we obviously don't exist in all those, and we don't see the spiritual realm. Paul even talks about, when he talks about, we do not fight against flesh and blood, but principalities and powers, like, and the cosmic, basically horrors of this world. Like, there's these horrible things that are happening outside of us that we can't see. This is all hinted to, also the fall of Satan and all these different things. Like, and it's funny that Christians try to deny it. It's like, well, no, to deny that would be to deny the word in so many ways. It's just there's things that we don't understand, but it's things that we can get hints at. Even in Revelation, there's a lot of that different pictures and whatnot that John was writing, and I can only imagine, or Isaiah, when he sees the very throne of God and like these creatures that are covered with eyes, and you're like, what sort of H.P. Lovecraftian monster?
that Isaiah and Ezekiel and Revelation are two things or three things actually that I'm still in the process of learning, and I will always be in the process of learning. But as I've kind of looked into the Jewish mystic beliefs and whatnot, I'm curious actually, because I have a feeling that a lot of the debate surrounding the events described in Revelation and in Daniel and whatnot are that's a Christian problem, because they don't understand the mystical nature of the writings that they're reading. Because they were written by a Jew who was mystically minded. I mean, John opens his gospel with, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." That's one of the most mystical phrases that exists in the whole Bible. And so, like, I have taken upon myself now to actually, like, I've got to where I can kind of think in the Jewish mystic mindset, at least, as much as a toddler can walk. So now I'm reading through Daniel, kind of along with the commentary, with that mystical understanding in the back of my head. And so I want to have that under my hat before I approach Revelation. So, like, I'm going to reapproach Revelation with new eyes, and I'm actually pretty excited about that.
Oh yeah, no, eschatology, like the study of the end times. How does all that work? How does Revelation fit in, and all that? So that's fascinated me, but not so that I know the views. I know the various views of it, and I've read it a few times, and I can start picking up on some of the things with the new information I have. But I'm far from fully being able to say, oh, I totally have a perfect grip on this, unchallenged. That's one of the things I hope I can get into more as I study more and more theology. There's just some other things in my way that I'm like, I feel like I have more pressing things to work through before I work through that. So anyway, what do you say real fast to people who thinks that this sort of talk is crazy talk?
Not much, really.
You're right.
We just see the world through. We see the world through different eyes. I typically try and explain some of the obvious examples, like I do with drugs or or sin, things that have that inherent nature. When you get into the mysticism, you get into the elements, and so it's like so that throws up big red flags for people, because it's like that whole earth, wind, fire, air, water, that whole thing. But when you think about it, like that kind of is what's necessary for most of creation to exist. You take a seed and you plant it in the ground where the earth is, and you water it, and you let it get sunlight, and you get it oxygen, and it will grow with whatever concentration of those elements God created that seed to absorb in its concentration to produce whatever fruit it's intended to produce.
Yeah,
it's scientific, but it's also mystical, more so than you'd realize when you think about that.
Well, that's the thing, is a lot of people just don't understand the fact that, well, no, guys, that science and the Bible very much go hand in hand all the time, and that's one of the biggest things. As soon as you start saying that, well, me as a believer, or me, we just can't accept some of those things because we accept the science. Or I was told by one person, well, science and faith just don't get along. I'm like, are you kidding me? You have faith. You have faith that the whole universe started on its own. Like, as a Christian, the very fact that when we were first started talking about this, what came to my mind was like, the universe began. That is my first initial argument of supernaturalism, of an idea of a mysticism, is the fact that there is something rather than nothing.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Well, what's your first evidence? You're looking at it.
Yeah. Prove to me that there's a God.
I'm finding
surrounded things.
a really hard. I'm trying to find examples. If only I could just find things that are like created from a mist. Yeah. This is why the atheist community probably is going to hate me eventually one day. But no, it's true. It's that's the thing. It's like the myth that you have to acknowledge supernaturalism to some degree or other in order for the universe to actually make sense. If you look at things only materialistically, then you really you fall short of even having the beginning of the universe at all, because the beginning of the universe, right, that's when time, space, and matter began. Okay, which means that there wasn't something at some point, which meant there was literally no thing. So something outside of time, space, and matter must have created it. Just God.
And that's kind of, again, that's also where like your realms come into play, is like if you understand that God can view all of time in a non-linear fashion, then you've acknowledged there's another realm where he exists.
Exactly. So we Molinists like myself are like, yes, So there it is. God knows all alternate realities, all what ifs and could be's, all, counterfactuals, as we like to say in our philosophical world to make us sound hoity-toity. But
the multiverse only exists in the mind of God. What is what is.
Can we put his picture up and put a little quote next to him and blast it over the church split? So anyway, so real quick, obviously we talked about, people are probably like, what on earth? We really went down some deep rabbit holes. But guys, we had Seamus on and we talked about like surface level stuff. I was like, okay, if we're going to have Brad on, we got to dig into something new. So this was fun. But my thing is, so I have two final questions for you, which is, what would your greatest advice be to those wanting to deepen their faith? And then how do you think your ministry could help unite the church? So first one, go.
What would your greatest advice be to those wanting to deepen their faith? Have an open mind. Obviously, use discernment, which is that's what the Bible is there for. Don't just take somebody with another doctrine, hook, line, and sinker. That's definitely not good. I would never encourage anybody to do that. But have an open enough mind to read stuff that you may not be comfortable reading, namely Judaic literature. I mean, the Bible, my dad puts it this way, the Bible is a Jewish book written by Jewish people about the Jewish faith and the Jewish Messiah. Okay.
What? That got oddly simple and yet somehow works. Okay.
I guess also I would add to that, if you're going to actually look into the Jewish writings, do it with humility. Okay, if you already go into it with this idea that you're just going to see how wrong they are because you're a Christian and you know better, it's like, first of all, get rid of that, because you really won't learn anything, because you won't be of a mind to see it. But when you do see it, you'll see things that you just never would have conceived of, because they ask the questions we don't think to ask.
Yeah, that's actually true. And that's I've seen people do that too, because when I was doing a research paper recently, I saw the guy was he's going through some of the rabbinical writings, and he was just almost scoffing and writing his easy rebuttals, almost straw manning them the entire time. And me, who's even remotely familiar, I wouldn't call myself a scholar in the Judaic world at all, but just familiar. I was like, oh my word, that's not what that means. Oh my word, that's not what he's saying. Oh my word, that's just a miss. It's just one miss after another. And so, yeah, going with some humility. And for those who think that, they also like Brad, they're like, oh my goodness, if he follows the Torah, how could he possibly be a Christian? Look, guys, Jesus himself followed the Torah. He was a rabbi, and he observed the Torah. So thinking that somebody's less Christian than you just because they observe something that you might not, or practice something that you don't, it's absurd. I find that Christians question people's salvation and their authenticity far too often when they shouldn't, and then they don't question it when they actually should.
Really, it's also not as limiting as people make it out to be. You think of it and you're like, oh my gosh, all those rules, and it's actually well, I have less rules now than when I did as an independent fundamental Baptist. I can wear shorts now.
I can show my kneecaps. Well, that's actually true. No, there's actually that really one of the few things is would be the kosher laws. That'd be one of the bigger ones, that big life-changing moments. But even then, that's not even too crazy. Just don't eat hot dogs, bacon, a few other things, refried beans, whatever. But anyway, it also. So now let's go. This obviously people are so divided. You're on the church split. You know what we do. So what is your idea, though, of how do you believe that your particular ministry could help unite the church?
Well, I think mainly that we expose. Our goal is to expose people to this kind of material, to this way of thinking, in kind of a way that's a little friendlier. We try our hardest to offend people gently, which is why we've organized it in a discussion format.
That's probably a better way to approach it. No, I think that's true, though, because no matter what the truth or even opposing ideals, they're offensive to people. So learning how to deliver them in a way that's coded with some grace and understanding. And that's what's the best part about it, is I never once got the idea that you guys were running in and beating me over the head. You never beat Brian over the head. You didn't. I've never seen you just straight out go into it with people. I've seen you show your teeth on social media when someone shows theirs, but even then, you're still not like a complete and total jerk about it. You're like, no, I'm just going to show you. Like, okay, you want to get a little sassy? Yeah, I can get a little sassy too, I suppose. But
that's because you know the new me.
Oh,
Seamus has seen the old days.
Oh, likewise, friend. I was known at Crown College of the Bible. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's an IFB school down in Tennessee. That's where I went, and I was known for being cantankerous and challenging everything and arguing everything to the ground. I was a jerk, I'll admit it. It was kind of fun, not gonna lie. Part of me enjoyed that, but then I realized later that's highly ineffective to actually teach anything. I mean, it's entertaining. No one can deny that. Like, even if you don't agree with the guy,
it's a lot of fun.
Oh yeah, I think people are watching on the sidelines are going, "Ooh, this is fun too." And you love. I mean, you sometimes get good zingers, but it's not effective, especially if you're trying to teach. And that's one of the things I've learned. And that's why I said it's like, okay, so here I have a friend that's Judaic. He's Jewish, really, in his faith. He recognizes Christ as Messiah, Jesus as Messiah. Almost says Christ as Messiah. That's so redundant. Anyway, I recognize Christ as Christ. For those of you guys who don't know, Christ is Messiah in Greek, and then Messiah is Messiah in Hebrew. So it's Messiah in Hebrew, hence, okay, whatever. All right, but so the point is here, I realized, like, instead of me going like, oh, well, let me say what I think is wrong with these, Jewish types, so let me see what's wrong with these Catholic types. It's like, well, how about we just have a conversation and learn how to just talk it out. Hey, what do you believe? Why do you believe it? And of course, these are more interviews, so these aren't even for me to just beat you over the head with anything I might even disagree with. But I find that this has been very beneficial. I find these conversations to build one another up. And I think it helps unite the church to realize, oh, wait, we're not enemies. When they actually see people just have a conversation. Oh, hey, he's not so bad. Yeah, no, he's not. So why do we demonize? Does that make sense?
That's actually something that I've mentioned before in videos that we've done, is that the idea that conflict, and you'll get Christians that anytime you mention anything that will start a conflict, it's like there shouldn't be division in the body, and it's like there already is. The fact that you go to a different denominated church is already division in the body. Like, we already disagree on things, right? So that presents a problem, especially to the outside world, because they're thinking, well, if these guys are right, then why can none of them agree?
True.
And so that's kind of where again, I've mentioned this, Judaism is a little more unified in that aspect, in that they don't agree on what applies, whereas how it's applied, they may have different traditions, but it's not a doctrinal point of, well, I'm going to start a different sect from you, At least with an orthodoxy, that would be the case, So you've got the things like the command not to, shave the sides of your head, and so they accept that to be the beard. But then the Hasidics take that to be like, the sideburns as well as the beard, and so like they just let their sideburns grow out super long. Whereas
I love those.
Right? It's super cool, right?
It's glorious beards.
But yeah, no, it's and so Hasidics are not going to tell other Jews that they're sinning for not growing out their sideburns. It's just like, okay, well, you still have hair there, so you're not shaving it. That's good. We agree,
That's that thing where I'm like, let's be united inside the house. We all recognize God is real. Elohim is truly he is the God of the universe. He is the creator of all things. We believe Jesus is the Messiah. We believe in salvation through faith. Because I know one of the biggest accusations you guys get is salvation by works. And it's like, well, if believing that doing these things that are the right things to do is salvation by works, then that means you thinking that stealing is wrong is also salvation by works. No, they're just making a different. They're saying this is a moral command that that we follow. It's not salvation by works. So we follow. So these are in-house topics. I say it all the time. Like we're all in the same house here. We all have different bedrooms that we might prefer to hang out with different members of the family that we connect with better. But we're still part of the same family. So why are we sit there and stabbing each other, attacking each other, fighting each other? Because I'm guessing it's going to be a lot of us that get to heaven and going to find out that, oh, I didn't have a perfect understanding of that. But is not God and not my faith and his ability to save us not above my intellectual understandings?
There needs to be a family discussion.
Exactly.
Within the house, there needs to be that struggle so that, that's how you come to a conclusion. That's how you come to an answer between you. And I think that's something that we offer is kind of the opportunity. We called it Killing the Church is the series that we're working on. And I always get asked about that. Well, why'd you go with that name? And it's like, well, it's a double
shock and awe.
Right? First of all, shock and awe, because you clicked on my video because that's what it was called.
Exactly. Yeah.
But on the other one, it's like, okay, well, we're discussing topics that we think are killing the church, and then on the other hand, discussing topics within the church that should be killed.
Exactly, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so and sometimes in a family conversation, you might have to sit down with one of your family members and go, "You're wrong." And
you got to have a come to Jesus meeting.
Yeah. Oh, wait. We're going to come to Jesus moment. We're going to take you behind the woodshed for a minute. All out of love. We still love you. You're still part of our family, but you're wrong. And we could battle it out for a few days. And there's nothing wrong with that. I disagree with certain people immensely, but it doesn't mean that they're not part of my family. It just means, we don't jive all the time on every single topic. We don't fire on all cylinders with each other. So anyhow, I could talk about that all day because I've literally been through 100 church splits, I feel like. So, but anyhow, Brad, is there anything you wanted to quickly close with before I let you go?
I guess, in closing, I understand that to many of you watching, I do sound absolutely crazy. But I would encourage you to go ahead and if there is anything that piqued your interest, then, go visit my channel, send a message, or if you have TikTok, I'm on TikTok, and find me that way. And my TikTok's actually really popular, but more on that later. Challenge me on it. Like, let's have a discussion. Give me content to film. That's what me and Seamus really want is to kind of to instigate the people to disagree with us, so that's just
so you have things to address.
Process that keeps giving.
Yeah, that's what I do with my King James Onlyist videos. I'm like taking screenshots of comments, and I'm like, I'm going to respond to these one day, like these objections. And or who knows? What if somebody in one of my videos makes a really darn good point in the comments and it just shoots me right between the eyes? I'm like, yep, he got me. Now I got to do my apology video that I was wrong.
Yeah, we got to do a redaction.
Yeah, I'm like, hey, my bad. I'm going to leave the video up, but put a little clip in front of it that says I was wrong. Don't listen to idiot Will. Listen to better Will over here. And that's okay. I think that's awesome. I love the fact that that's what makes us, I feel like, connect. Is just the fact that we're all here on the same road seeking truth, and we're not afraid to challenge our ideas, and we're not afraid to talk to people who we disagree with even. And so that's awesome. So I appreciate you coming on, Brad. Thank you all for watching the Church Split. And again, if you haven't already, this is literally like my fourth time with Altarnate Media. Like, what are you doing? Subscribe to their channel. Go there. Like, sub, do the thing. Share it around. Get them around. Because I know they're big on TikTok and they're big on all these other areas. But, let's get that YouTube channel rolling. Come on. Right? Cool.
Absolutely, man.
All right. Thanks, man. I appreciate it. You take care, and shalomi, my homie.
Shalomi, my homie.